there are different phases of it. In the early phase of the Great Depression, when jobs were being lost, when unions were under attack, and when indeed the whole economic order seemed to be crumbling around working people, there were a series of ways in which workers resisted and fought back. They, for instance, fought defensive struggles against wage cuts. They, in their communities, organized rent strikes against rising rents, tenants' rights organizations against evictions. There were informal neighborhood kind of bodies of working class people who, if particular, for instance, large retail outlets were seen to be gouging people and charging excessive prices, they would actually sometimes organize almost commando raids on those stores where they just take things off the shelves and walk out. This is distinguished very much from the kind of looting that we might see in certain riots now, in the sense that it was understood to be more than just appropriating individual goods for one's self-use. It was appropriating necessities on the part of kind of a working class community. And it wasn't, I wouldn't say this was a common activity, but it did happen, and it was collectively mobilized. I think the most common actions were actually of organizations that fought evictions. People who were basically being kicked out on their streets. He brought together communists, CCFers, and various independent types who, some of them not necessarily radical, who thought this was just sort of beyond the pale that this would be happening. And, you know, there would be the equivalent of, you know, communication networks, phone trees. Then the landlord was evicting somebody, and they would go and they would basically, you know, the locks might have been changed, but they would have a locksmith that could open the door, and they would just pile all the furniture and stuff and take it back in. And they would try, you know, sometimes to organize some rent benefits to actually get the money to pay some of the rent. But they basically wanted also to serve notice that landlords didn't have this kind of, in the precipitous crisis of the Great Depression, didn't necessarily just have the right to kind of, you know, put people on the street. And it was a kind of self-activity. It was often outside of unions, but it wasn't outside of either neighborhood or radical kind of connective links that had been, you know, in existence throughout the Depression in these districts. We have to understand that while there was radicalism in the Great Depression, and while there were working class initiatives, it actually took some time to develop. And in the early years of the Great Depression, from say late 1929 into 1934, when the Depression was actually at its worst and all the economic indices took a real plunge. Unemployment rose, jobs were lost, union advances were halted. Most strikes were defensive against wage cuts, and many of them were not successful. In this period, actually, you know, the level of strike activity and the level of, for instance, union organizing dropped off. Strike activity was still there, but if you go back to the high water mark of 1919 to 1920 and compare, for instance, strikes then to strikes in 1929, 30, and 31, it's about, you know, a quarter of the activity. And most of these strikes were led by the Communist Party that had decided on a policy in 1929. It's called the Third Period. And part of the policy change in the Communist International was that this was a period of radicalization. Revolution was around the corner. The Communist Party would be the vanguard. It didn't want any truck or trade with other left organizations, like, for instance, the Social Democrats, whom they called social fascists. And so, basically, they formed their own red unions because they weren't going to be involved with the AFML craft unions and the mainstream trade union movement. Ironically, I think that isolated them from, you know, the possibilities of interacting with many, many more workers and with intersecting with the mainstream trade union movement. So it actually, while communists led most of the strikes, the strike totals were actually quite low. They shifted gears after the failure of this third period policy, particularly because of the rise of fascism in Germany, right, where the policy of, the communists fighting alone wasn't clearly stopping Hitler. So they needed to have more alliance with other groups. They developed a Popular Front orientation. The Popular Front was basically, instead of saying it's class against class, we stand alone, we're the revolutionary vanguard, you're a social fascist. Instead it was, the Popular Front was probably an indiscriminate kind of alliance of communists with almost anybody who was, somewhere on the left. So they would even align with sort of bourgeois politicians. In France, they actually joined governments and had a couple of seats. It did not work out well because it suppressed, basically, the radical initiative and program. But what it did do is it pushed the communists back into the unions in North America. So where they'd been separate in the third period in 1930, up to 1934, by 1935 and after, communists were key organizers in the unions, and in particular in the rising Congress of Industrial Organization unions, the mass production unions. And they played key roles in organizing and developing mass production unionism in North America. The difficulty was that they didn't necessarily have an independent voice. They didn't have their own program. They didn't have they weren't building the left. They were building the mass production unions, and the people who eventually gained from that were people like Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the Democratic Party in the U.S., who was seen by various initiatives that they made. They were seen to be kind of encouraging unionism, and so many mass production workers flocked to the ranks of the Democratic Party, not to the ranks of the Communist Party. And people like John L. Lewis, who was a major trade union leader at the time, and certainly no radical, he also gained because he was the leading figure who in some senses was using the communists to do his organizing for him. So when challenged actually by really right-wing forces, wasn't he worried about the influence of communists in the CIO? He offered with a kind of laugh the rejoinder, well, not really, I'm not worried. Who gets the bird, the hunter or the dog? In other words, the communists were really doing his bidding. They were kind of his hunting dogs, working for him. The Rand formula after the Windsor strike. Trade unions had been struggling to get this kind of security that the Union checkoff provided. It was a victory for unions. But like all victories of unions within the structure of sort of capitalist authority, which that victory was, it's two-sided. So the problem was the unions achieved a stability, they won a victory, but what it ended up doing was, in some senses, severing union leaderships from their memberships. And so it fed into a kind of bureaucratization of unions, the distancing of union leaderships from their members. And that, of course, over time, became quite acute. For those people who were on the left, I think the lessons from the Great Depression are pretty clear, that what was good that came out of the Depression and everything that could have come out of it that might have been even better was in fact because there was a strong, organized left presence. Today we have less of that, and I think the message is we have to build it. Now, how we build it is an incredibly complicated and difficult question, and there are many challenges in the kind of road to, putting things together. But I think without a left presence, both outside the unions and embedded within them, the effectiveness of an actual fight against the current economic crisis is severely handicapped.